Have you ever wondered if there is a connection between UFO mysteries and the paranormal world? Perhaps at some point, you have thought that there is a connection between these mysteries that we have not yet discovered. Maybe the presence of extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings is related to the appearances and other supernatural phenomena that occur in our world. With this in mind, let me tell you a story. John, Mike, and Charles were three brothers who lived with their family in a small house on the outskirts of town, near the forest. The three of them worked on the ranch, and in the afternoons, they herded the cattle that grazed all day. At night, they returned home and corralled the cattle. One night, while they were eating dinner, they heard a loud noise coming from the forest, as if a large stone had fallen from some hill. As a result of the noise, John, the eldest, took his father's lantern and went to see what had caused it. However, as it was night, he did not enter the forest. Instead, he walked around the yard, checked the cattle pen and, finding nothing, returned home. During the night, the animals made noise, which was unusual since they were supposed to be asleep. In the morning, their mother's scream woke them up. The corral was open, blood and guts scattered everywhere, pieces of the cows scattered around the yard. Immediately, the brothers went out to see why their mother had screamed. Witnessing the gruesome spectacle, they began to search for traces of what or who could have committed such an atrocity. It couldn't have been a coyote or a dog, it had to be something bigger, they told themselves. "There are 5 cows," said the younger brother, who was examining the animals that had met such a fatal end. Mike, for his part, observed that the cuts on the animals were jagged. However, he thought that whatever had made the cuts had to be very sharp. After collecting and burning the remains, they began to discuss what had happened. The situation was unprecedented, and everyone was frightened. They couldn't even imagine the size of the creature that could have done this. Assuming it really was an animal, Charles said as he grabbed the keys to the truck and headed for a neighbor who didn't live too far away. Maybe he would know if there were any wild animals on the loose. Meanwhile, John and Mike agreed to find out the cause of the noise they had heard during the night. So, around noon, they armed themselves and headed into the woods. After walking for a few minutes, they found some downed trees, as if a large boulder had fallen from the top of the hill. That was their initial guess, but after searching, they found no stone. They tried to look for tracks or signs. Maybe a rider was on the hill at night, the horse slipped and they fell. But that explanation made no sense, since no horse, even with a rider, would be heavy enough to knock down a single tree, let alone several. Trying to search for explanations among themselves and without reaching any conclusion, they decided to return home. Simultaneously, Charles told the neighbor about the cattle incident. After hearing the story, the neighbor, clearly frightened, replied that he had not heard anything similar on the radio among the locals. He did, however, mention that they had heard a very loud noise, as if something very large had fallen from the top of that hill, pointing into the woods. With that information, he returned home. In the evening, when they regrouped, they decided to stay awake, to see if whatever had attacked the animals would return. John decided to have his brothers stay in the kitchen. From there they could have a direct view of the yard. If something attacked from there, they could shoot with a hunting rifle they had, thinking they might encounter something like a panther or some kind of tiger. They couldn't imagine anything bigger. John chose to hide on the high part of a large rock that served as a wall, fixing his gaze on the line that led to the corral fence. Hours later, each in position, they waited. The sky was clear and the moon illuminated the surrounding landscape. Although the light was dim, they could clearly see the corral and the cattle in front of them. With the cattle inside the corral, the 3 brothers were on high alert. Tension hung in the air, with each of them silent, observing everything. The sound of crickets and the wind were the only audible noises. As the minutes passed, anxiety grew with every little noise they heard. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed outside the house, as if something had come at high speed and crashed into the corral. John, from his vantage point, felt the impact, but could not discern what it was. Meanwhile, Mike and Charles exchanged terror-filled glances, unable to find words to describe what they could see: an unknown creature, a humanoid figure over 6 feet tall. It had something resembling a large horn on its head, and its mouth featured large teeth that protruded prominently. It had huge arms that looked armored and ended in enormous claws. Standing upright, and ready to pounce on the cattle in the corral, John found it so. Unable to see clearly from above the rock, he jumped down to get a closer look at what had arrived in the corral. Realizing he had never seen such an animal before, and not knowing how to deal with it, he froze. His brothers inside the kitchen were equally stunned, but knew that immediate action was needed to save not only their livestock, but also their brother from this monstrous creature. A shot rang out. It was Mike who hit the monster in the chest. The loud sound brought John out of his paralysis, as he saw how the shot hit directly into the creature's chest, but the impact only bounced off, drawing sparks, without hurting it in any way. The creature in front of him let out a high-pitched screech, baring its fangs and claws. In an instant, it pounced on John, who, in shock, recoiled and fell to the floor. His brothers came out of the kitchen and, this time, both fired. Whatever was in front of them did not even flinch at the shots. It made no effort to dodge them. Now, the target was no longer the cattle, it was the 3 brothers. With one leap, it pounced on Mike, throwing him about 10 feet away. Charles, terrified, fired at point-blank range, but the shot had no effect. After emitting a high-pitched scream, the creature launched a lunge aimed directly at Charles's chest. Raising the rifle and both hands out of pure instinct, he managed to lessen the damage, but received a deep wound in one arm. The impact knocked him down, leaving him incapacitated. Seeing Charles lying there bleeding and Mike trying to get up from a distance, John took aim and fired directly at the back of the creature's head. The shot hit the target but didn't seem to hurt him. Immediately, the creature turned and charged John, who had dropped the rifle, leaving it at his mercy on the ground and unarmed. Just as the creature raised its arm to strike John to the ground, it opened its mouth, emitting that annoying screeching sound. Suddenly, a shot rang out. It was Mike who hit the monster's mouth directly. Who, now wounded, forgot about John. Now, Mike was in his sights. Suddenly, something shone brightly from inside the forest, catching his attention, and stopping immediately. The glow came from far away, but it illuminated the whole yard. It was a white, cylinder-shaped light that seemed to originate deep in the forest, and ascend toward the sky. The 3 brothers, astonished, saw how the monster, as soon as it saw the light, moved away in the opposite direction, as if fleeing. The glow lasted for about a minute. At that moment, both John and Mike approached Charles to lend him support, as his arm was practically torn. His mother, who had run out of the house, witnessed the whole thing without being able to intervene. They loaded Charles into the truck and took him to town so that he could be seen by the doctor. Still in the early morning hours, John and Mike left Charles in the care of the doctors. His mother stayed with him. Then they took the van, determined to go to the place where they had seen the light. They drove as far as the road would allow and then, armed, began to walk. After about 40 minutes walking through the forest, they learned that they were near a neighbor's house. It was dawn when they finally spotted the house. The house was destroyed. As they approached, they heard muffled screams a few meters away from the remains of the house. It was one of the sons of that family. As they approached him, they saw him covered in blood and dirt. It looked like whatever had destroyed his house had thrown him far away. John picked him up and asked him what had happened. Looking at his face, he realized that he was now blind. The young man told them that during the night he felt the need to go to the bathroom. He went out and, upon returning, saw a bright, blinding light, as if the sun itself had fallen from the sky. The next thing he remembered was lying in the rubble of the house. As the young man recounted his experience, Mike observed marks on the ground, traces of earth, wood, and the remains of burned things. Nearby, he saw two shadows on the ground that looked like charred remains, but he found no physical remains, only the shadowy silhouettes on the ground. After hearing the boy's story, John picked him up and handed him to Mike. "Take him in the van to the doctor. I'll look for his parents in the rubble or nearby." Mike picked up the boy and left. Meanwhile, John began searching through the rubble. Finding nothing, he widened his search in the surrounding area. Despite all his efforts, he found nothing. Without giving up hope, he decided to walk a little further, thinking that if anyone had survived, he might have gone upstream, since another family lived nearby. He walked for half an hour through the forest, without taking the path along the river. There he saw something he would not have imagined even in his worst nightmares. John stopped abruptly and hid behind a large tree. From there, a few paces away, he saw what he at first thought were people walking along the river. However, upon closer inspection, they looked like upright humanoid figures. Their appearance was strange and disturbing. Their skin was a pale shade of blue with a strange sheen, and their limbs were long and thin, apparently designed for agility and speed. He could not see their faces, nor how they advanced. He counted them. There were 7 of them, with one of them a few steps ahead. This figure was holding the remains of what appeared to be the monster they had fought the night before. As John watched them, he felt fear grip him and his heart pounded in his chest. He had a feeling that those figures were not human. With these thoughts in mind, John knew he could do nothing against them if he attacked them. Suddenly, he felt a strong wind, and he felt as if he had no energy, as if he were fainting. Before collapsing to the ground, he could see how those figures began to disappear. He didn't see them move away, or address anything, they just started to fade away one by one. He fell asleep on the floor. When he woke up, he had a metallic taste in his mouth, something very strange and unfamiliar. When he got up, the first thing he looked for were the humanoid figures, but there was no sign of them. He returned home and when he arrived, his family were already there. His mother ran to hug him, and Mike asked where he had been. The last time Mike saw him was when they found the young man. "I left the child at the doctor's and, while we were waiting for Charles, another doctor told me that the child had very strange injuries. He had burns on his body, that's why he was covered with blood. But the strangest thing was that he had something called sudden blindness, which is very rare because that kind of damage usually occurs in areas where there were nuclear explosions. Since I didn't understand what he meant, I told him that I hoped the boy would recover. We went home with Charles and later I went to find an aunt of the child to come and see him. But since then, it's been almost a week," Mike explained, while John's face was full of confusion, because he didn't understand how 3 days had passed when he remembered seeing those humanoid figures in the morning. The last thing he remembered was feeling sleepy and sleeping, but 3 days was too long. Afterwards, he told his family what he had seen, and they could not be incredulous, as they had witnessed the monster attacking them at night. For those who are still listening, it's evident that the events of that night in the forest defy a simple explanation. One might think it was a small-scale extraterrestrial attack, the cylindrical light that illuminated the entire courtyard and the destruction of the cabin point to something very powerful happening in the forest. The presence of nuclear shadows and the metallic taste in the mouths of some survivors suggest that it could have been a nuclear event, but it is not known for certain what caused this explosion. What is known is that John witnessed something not human. The events of that night remain a mystery. If you liked the video, I invite you to leave your like, and to subscribe if you haven't done it yet. Let me know your concerns in the comments, I'll read you. Without further ado, see you later, with a new story.